On deer management and food plots 101.
Good evening, everybody. How's everyone doing? Good. All right. So Ben had asked me to come out here to cover this kind of two parts: a little bit of food plots, a little bit of deer management, kind of give an overview, a very quick overview of deer management and food plots. So I'm going to try to hit the high points. And also at the end, I'm going to provide you with basically a really great resource, especially for the food plot component. What I use as a resource that I think is worth every penny. So at least you can take that home with you, and it may have some application for other things outside of food plots. But basically, when we talk about managing wildlife, it really comes down to looking at the property you're trying to manage, whether that's your own property, a property you lease, or even in a cooperative where you're looking at your own property, your neighbor's property, and trying to move towards a specific management goal. Since we're here to talk about deer, I'm going to assume it's a deer management goal. It's probably related to either the population size or the antler size that are existing within your population. All those goals, no matter what, are always going to be very species specific and sometimes community specific. So, right, so you can have waterfowl is an example of a community, right? So you have a bunch of different duck species that are all going to act very similar and benefit from similar practices. But the way you have to think about this in terms of looking at your priorities of a management plan and a management goal is, the animals that are on your property, unless you own a very large property or leasing a very large property, are going to spend at least some part of their life not on the property. When we talk about property size for deer, you're talking about 1,000 acres is not large enough to keep deer on the property. 10,000 acres is not large enough to keep deer on the property. The more we've learned about deer movement, deer behavior, they travel quite a bit. And they'll take, not only will they disperse off your property and leave it permanently, but frequently they take what are called excursion movements or sallies, where they'll temporarily leave your property and go maybe 5, 6, 7, 10, 15 miles away, spend a little bit of time there, maybe hours, maybe days, and then come back. So it's very hard to hold animals on your property all the time. But you can try to increase the amount of time they spend on your property by meeting the needs of the individuals that are there. So what that could be, and generally what we manage for, are things like food, cover. If it's a bird species like a turkey, we're talking about nesting habitat, brooding habitat. Other species, it's hibernating areas. But for deer, it's things like food, cover, fawning cover, winter cover, escape cover for hunting, for predators. So you're really looking at two major things, and that's food cover and water availability, which a lot of times food is feeding that. So what does that actually mean? What is the food that you're looking to try to have on your property for deer? Well, deer eat a lot of vegetation, right? So they're browsers. They eat trees. They also eat a total of 720 different species of plants. So they pretty much, if it's green, they'll consume it, or at least try to consume it. Now they put those plants at different levels. So there's things that they highly prefer, down to things that they'll eat at emergency level when there's nothing else there. So things that are highly preferred are things like mast, right? Acorns. We're all gonna, come October, we potentially are out in a tree stand, deer are patternable, and all of a sudden there's like a switch that goes off, people call it the October lull. The deer are basically around acorns and they're not moving, they're there. Because that's the only thing they need, and it's so highly valued nutritionally that they don't have to go anywhere else, and they want to eat as much as possible because it calorie-wise, and it allows them to put the fat on they need going in the winter or into the rut. But mast is highly preferred. Outside of acorns, you have soft mast, grapes, just any orchard plant, right? Persimmons, all of those are high on the list, especially when they're ripe. Oddly enough, deer will consume a lot of other things. They've been documented eating dead fish. bird eggs, and even feeding on gut piles of other deer. So they will consume about anything you try to eat it, especially when they're not healthy. So when we talk about cover, the idea is, I kind of mentioned already a few of them, but it is going to be linked heavily to either time periods in their life, so right, fawning or adult cover, two different things. Fawning cover has a lot more needs because those guys are mobily restricted, and also their predator avoidance strategy is high. So they need certain conditions at that point in their life for a few weeks that are very different from all the adults that are in the population. So we have basically the idea of reproductive cover as considered a separate item. Then you have things like winter cover, which down here in Kentucky, not as important as say in Minnesota, but it is something that is a item that you should be at least thinking about. If you have things, did you guys get an ice storm? We had a pretty heavy one in the east and central part. You guys have ice? This past one, just a little bit. So that's something where having a thicket of cedars or pine trees is going to buffer from that just a little bit, but it becomes very important in those extreme weather events. More so in the north where they're more common, but it is something that can be important on certain years here. Other items that can be used as cover that strategically can be somewhat advantageous for hunters are the idea of travel corridors, where you put basically right into a riparian area or some kind of habitat link, say a swale in a field that's filled with grasses. Those areas will be used more heavily because they're providing some kind of concealment for the animals as they travel between habitat patches to and from other sources of cover or food. So we can break that down a little further by thinking about types of cover that exist. And I'm in the forestry department, so we always I get a lot of pressure to talk about trees, a substantial amount. Y'all have not as much trees out here as we do in the eastern part of the state. So it is something to be thinking about in terms of age structure, composition, and basically diversity of those plants. So we kind of lump these into mature forests, larger trees, generally hardwoods. So these are going to be your mass producers in terms of oaks, but you may run into some of your conifers. Hemlock, obviously you guys don't have that out here, but you will have pines. And they do provide that extreme weather buffer. Heavily used by various species, but deer are going to target these, especially during mass production. On the extreme opposite end, and this is probably the one thing that most folks need to increase on their properties, is the early successional component. The young forests, the grasslands, generally created by a disturbance event, whether that be logging, fire, disking, mowing, something that basically breaks up that succession of the plants as they move forward. And the reason why this is kind of important is this really is your cover creator. This type of cover or habitat is your cover for a lot of species, including your fawns and your adult deer, especially during the winter. It is going to be a thick, it's the areas that you don't want to walk through, and the areas that you hope when you move the deer that they don't run into because you don't want to go in there and find it. Okay? Those are the types of places that they need for cover. Thick understory, vines, shrubs, saplings. Also going to have a high diversity of tree species, a lot of soft mass producers. So this is a different food component along with the cover component. So you'll see things, your grapevines, your blackberries, those are kind of things you'll see popping up in there. We generally, when we talk about forest management, we like to see about 15-ish% of the forest being early successional habitat. When you're talking about game management outside in general, you want to have a very large component of young cover around because it's providing both food and cover. So if your property is basically this and nothing like this, you're missing cover. The in-between can have a little bit of everything. Generally, it's our most common forest type within the state, where you have some older trees, they're getting into mass production. You have a decent understory here, mid-story, some trees that are filling gaps, and then you have ground cover underneath, that's various herbaceous layers. This is a good, healthy forest. There's nothing wrong with this. It's providing turkey habitat, it's providing fawning habitat. There's stuff that's down here for them to eat. Come winter though, you're going to be able to see 200 or 300 yards. So when those leaves come off, you lose that cover. And that's why that younger forest becomes more important. Alternatively to young forests, you can have things like grasslands. Okay, this is can either be completely young forest, but typically what is the difference between a grassland and a young forest is you don't have those tree species really abundant within the system. They're not popping up till 4 or 5 years in, and at that point, if you want to maintain the grass, and you're doing some type of disturbance mechanism to kill those saplings as they pop up. So you're going to see a lot more forbs and grasses within the system, and we have very few remnant grasslands left. So a lot of times you're planting this mix. So this composition is going to be dependent on the mix you plant. So there's farm bill programs out there that are pollinator mixes. So they're heavy on the forbs that are producing, flowers, black-eyed Susan, stroke flowers, butterfly weed, those kind of mixes that are there for pollinators. They do have a benefit to deer, but they tend to be short. So their cover level benefit is not as good. You can get into some heavier big blue stem, gamer grass, switchgrass mixes that are going to get up and provide cover year round, that are going to hold up to winter storms. Or you can throw a little bit of everything in and get a really diverse stand, but then structurally you may not have a big patch of cover like wood. Good for turkeys, good for quail, good in general to have for wildlife as a bigger pool of species. Does require active management. A lot of times you can meet some of these goals, and traditionally the Farm Bill has done this by doing some field edge plantings. So 30, 50, 60 feet of your edge of your field, you can throw this in there, which works for deer, not as beneficial for things like quail and turkey if you don't have a lot of it, because this is really easily searched by raccoons, skunks, and possums for nesting. That's the downside to it. You don't have to worry about that as much as fawns, because those three don't eat fawns. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some forest management strategies that may or may not be applicable to you all, depending on the size of forest on your property. If you don't have a lot, then you got to be thinking of whether or not you need to just kind of treat it in terms of invasive species and make it as healthy a woodlot as possible. If you do have a bunch, there are some harvesting strategies that are more beneficial for deer and other wildlife than others. We talked a lot about trying to increase that early successional habitat, and that really comes down to forest strategy, management strategy, silviculture prescriptions of clear cut or expanding gap, where you're trying to basically just increase the light level on the forest floor. The more light, the more growth you get, and it starts out as herbaceous growth and it switches over to the tree growth. So the more you can open up that and let the light shine down, the more early successional habitat you're going to create. And that's going to equal more food and cover areas for deer. There's other harvesting strategies, and these are, the terms are really forest terms. The big thing to be thinking about here is how many trees are getting removed, and what does that equal in terms of a response from vegetation. So shelter wood harvest is a pretty heavy harvest. You can see that it's removing somewhere around 60% to 70% of the standing trees. And the whole idea behind this is you are trying to get an extreme response for the next layer of growth. There's a lot of light, there's a lot of gaps in the canopy here where light's hitting the ground, so this is going to become very dense, and you'll have a very young stand as the dominant component of this area. So lots of cover, lots of food. You still have trees that are left in here are usually going to be ones that are going to, sometimes they're called seed trees. So you can choose what you want to leave. A forester is going to try to balance that based on your management strategies. If you want to make money from a cut, they're going to take a lot more oak out. Oak is where the money is right now. They're going to leave other things that may not be as beneficial to wildlife, but they're still, in terms of structure, they're still there. But if you want to favor deer, you're going to want to leave more mass trees and promote more young oak growth underneath. Oaks do need light to grow. It's kind of an intermittent level. If there's too much light, they lose to things like tulip poplar. If there's too little light, they lose to things like maples and beech trees. So you kind of need to open it up just enough to let those oaks come up. And you do want to have that. So this is a strategy they use pretty heavily to regenerate oaks. The expanded gap is another one. Other strategies that can be implemented that are not necessarily a complete cut one of it's called crop tree release, and that's basically where you are looking at your crop trees. So in this case, it would be mass producers, hard mass producers, your oaks, and if they're crowded by all these trees that are not producing food, you are going to try to release them from that competition in the canopy by cutting those trees down. Let that light hit the entire surrounding, all of the canopy that tree has. What these trees will then do is they will quickly grow out into those gaps to fill it, to take advantage of that light resource, producing more branching, more leaves, and more mass. So therefore, you can actually increase acorn production over time by releasing those crop trees, so oaks, in the case of deer management, from their competition. Other items that you can do to try in terms of forest management, have you all heard of hinge cutting, live felling? Is anyone using it on their property? Have it gone well? Are they completely taking the regrowth off the top? Yeah. So, what species are you mostly cutting?
Just not the mass trees, but anything around.
So maples.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So
trees,
what was that?
Ham and stuff like that.
Yeah, and that's how to do it. So hinge cutting, live felling is basically you're going to try to find mid-story level trees. So those that are maybe 15, 20 feet tall, about 10 EVH around. So something like basketball, well not basketball size, maybe volleyball size or less in diameter. And if it's a non-desirable species, so your maples, your beech, it could be anything that's basically not oak. What you do is you take a chainsaw or a handsaw if it's small enough, and you cut almost all the way through, and then you push it over. And you don't want to cut all the way through because this, the attachment, that hinge, this is where it gets the name, allows some nutrients to flow up to the remnant of the canopy top. And because that is a stress inducer in the tree, the reaction of the tree is to create all of these suckers that go up to try to have that tree recover. That is all fresh new growth, and it'll happen for 3 to 5 years. Is highly nutritious, and deer, rabbits, if it's on the ground, all those, they'll just take it all off. And new growth is always going to be more nutritious than older browse that's sitting there. So it's a pretty quick way of increasing food. It also, when you think about it, that canopy top's laying on the ground, that's a visual obstruction, so you're somewhat increasing cover for deer, and also things like turkey, quail, rabbits, and so on are going to use that top. The downside that you have to be aware of is if you do too much of this, this is still taking up floor space, So if you're trying to recruit folks, it's going to damper that down a little bit. So be cognizant of where you're doing. So that can be worked into this idea of mid-story removal. And that's really, you can go through, you can leave your larger trees, but if you're trying to increase light to the ground floor, you may not see a lot of regeneration down there. You can get rid of the mid-story, so everything that's clogging up that light from getting down there, and usually it's things like maples and beech that are shade-tolerant species. Take them out. You can do this with a chainsaw. Just take them out, put them on the ground, and then that light will hit, and anywhere there's light, you're going to see a burst of new growth within a year or two. Food, cover for fawns, cover for turkeys. And finally, since we're really in a fragmented landscape out here, this is one that actually is a pretty good tool that's beneficial for rabbits, quail, turkeys. Is trying to soften your forest edges. So as they come up to either a fescue field or a crop edge, what you can do is a treatment called edge feathering. And it's a way of creating early successional cover right on the edge of the woodlot where it meets the field, because you're getting some more sunlight on the ground through a distance. So what you would want to do is from that field edge, you want to work your way in and 15, 20 foot sections, maybe 3 different sections. First section, you get rid of all the canopy. So you're allowing grasses to come up and hopefully forbs and some shrubs. Next 15, 20 foot section, you get rid of maybe 1/3 to 2/3 of the canopy and kind of intermix it, which will allow more light to hit in different areas, but you do get some trees, and generally you're going to get your soft mass producing trees that are going to do pretty well now. So you'll get things like persimmons will take advantage of that, plums, and cherries. So you get some food production. You still have enough sunlight hitting the ground to get a big burst of growth, creates cover. Last section you leave maybe 75%, so you get some larger trees, still get a little bit of growth, but it allows you to kind of soften that transition between those ecotypes, creating early succession cover, travel corridors, so you can manipulate, if you're on the hunting side, you can manipulate where deer come out, using what you knock down. If you are handy and want to do that, and make them walk out in front of a tree stand. But it's a pretty good tool, and that, anything you knock out is going to last 5-ish years. So it's a good all-around game management strategy for edges. So slowly transition to the second part here. But finally, one of the strategies that you can use outside of forest management is trying to basically increase food availability by putting food plots. And what that is really doing is just increasing your available forage to the deer in the area. There's all kinds of options that you can plant. You all are probably more familiar with the options that are out there than I am. You can also go, there's a push to create orchards as well, with both your hard or soft mats. One thing I will say is, with food plots, and we're going to go into the how-to of food plots. Every crop field that's out here is a food plot for deer. I'm sure some of you are probably farmers, and very well know how much deer are eating your crops. All food plot is basically farming for deer. So we are not food limited in Western Kentucky or Central Kentucky, and pretty much the entire state outside of Southeast Kentucky, in that mass years, deer are not food limited. In the South, where the soil is not very good, nutrition is a limiting factor. Because the forage that's there, that's growing out of that soil, is just not as high quality. Right? The reason we are a horse state, and the reason we are a top 5 human profit state, is because we have good soil, good nutrients, and our deer are super healthy. So food plots really are not necessary for increasing forage. They are good at attracting deer to certain locations at certain times. That's what they do. But if you want to try to make sure that you have a healthy herd and a well-balanced habitat for wildlife, food plot should not be a major component of your management strategy. they should, it's suggested that they make up less than 2% of your management plan and property. So that's just my little tidbit, you know, that's how we use food plots. Now, if you were in Alabama and down in southern Alabama, we'd be talking about how you need to put food plots in the raised storage building, but we're not. We don't have entire areas surrounded by lines. So if you're managing your woods and your property and providing a diversity of habitats, your deer are fine in terms of nutritional level for food plots. Questions on that before I move into the how-tos for creating a food plot? I'm sorry, my Yankee component is kicking in here. I'm probably talking a little fast. I apologize. Okay. So, if you're interested in putting a food plot in, the how-tos, you know, I always say you need to ask the question, is it the right choice for your situation? Do you have a management plan that's not just put a food plot in? You may be in a situation where you can't do anything other than put a food plot in. Then that's your choice that you have, and there's nothing wrong with that. Other questions that you need to be thinking about are things like, where should I put it? What should I plant? And how do I manage that through time? Because most cases, you can't just plant it and walk away and forget about it. That doesn't usually bode well come hunting season. So the why are you planting it? We kind of just talked about what is food limiting. You know that out here it really isn't. But if you're thinking about attracting deer for hunting purposes, then that puts you on a pathway for what do you want to choose and where and why do you want to plant it. The thing to keep in mind is if you're planting it to grow a larger population or try to grow larger antlers, for deer, we're already having a pretty good population of deer, and they're already pretty much saturated and have all the food they need, the nutrition they need. Science doesn't really back that food plots will make larger antlers. The best thing you can do is just let your deer get older. So I'm going to hammer this point home, right? So if you have that mix of native grasses, healthy landscapes, your deer are not going to be food limited. The only situation that we experience food limitation is when we have too many deer in the population, they actually keep themselves out of house and home. You start seeing situations where you can look through your woods and see a browse line, or no matter the fact you open up the canopy and let light in, you get no growth that's not getting mowed to the ground. Those are signs that you have too many deer. You gotta start shooting a lot of those. That's where your deer are going to be nutritionally limited. What you can, and I talked about what you will have success with, is if you want to put a food plot in, the reality of why is that they do work. You are providing a high quality nutritional item in the landscape, and animals will go to that item to take advantage of that nutrition because they don't have to walk as much. They're lazy, right? So you don't have to walk as much and spend as much energy to meet your nutritional needs if you can get it in 10 bites rather than 20 bites if you walk through the forest. So deer, if your food plot is there, will come to it to take advantage of it. And that's why it is advantageous for things like attracting animals to certification, whether that be for hunting or other purposes. So I mentioned it already, there is no data supporting that claims that you will get larger antlers if you plant food plots. If you want bigger antlers, you need to have your bucks get into 4.5, 5.5, 6.5 years old. That's what you need. And even on top of that, you want to have as close to a 1-to-1 buck to doe ratio in your population as possible, because then they aren't chasing those around into January and February, wearing themselves out and have a harder time recovering. So let your deer get older and make sure you don't have too many days. That's how you get bigger antlers. Excuse me. So if you're ready to put a food plot in, you have multiple things to think about. First and foremost, the where is going to be limited by what you have available to work with, right? The property you're on, the property you own, the property you lease, and your access points. Size kind of depends on that, as well as how much effort and ability you have in terms of equipment. Do you have a large tractor? Are you going to walk through and seed it by hand? Do you have a disc available? All those things are going to play into your ability to plant a food plot to a certain size. If you have access to regular farming equipment, you can plant whatever size food plot you want, as long as that plot is somewhere you can get to it with the equipment. Because if you can't get to it, or it's hard to get to it, then you're going to have a hard time maintaining it, going in and spraying it, or causing a pretty big disturbance event if you have to go in with major equipment, potentially at the wrong time of year. Strategies that are often used, putting food plots, especially smaller food plots along corners of woods and fields, edges of fields where maybe you have a cornfield or a soybean field and you want to just put a clover strip right on the edge next to the woods. That works pretty well, so your soybean and corn aren't going to do as well immediately adjacent to trees. So it's a good place to give up that for actual row crop to get that added additional benefit. Most of you that are here that are hunters know that secluded areas are going to get a lot more deer traffic than high traffic areas that are easily seen by other folks or have cars going by or ATVs. So if you're hoping to use it for hunting, the more tucked away you can get it, the better off you are. And it's even better if you can put it closer to bedding cover or other, escape cover, because that's going to give them a sense of comfort. And if you put it where they only have to take 20 or 30 steps to get to food, they're going to use it a lot. But with that said, you have to be thinking about access if you want to hunt it. Can you get in there without disturbing that bedding area? Because that will just defeat the purpose if you can't. General rule of thumb for plot size, smaller plots are a lot more useful for archery hunters. Larger plots you can reach out and poke with guns, so those will go well for gun hunting. But with smaller plots, you have to be thinking about the pressure that they can come under after they're planted. Most of you are probably pretty familiar with what deer will do to a soybean field along the edges the first 6 weeks. They will do the same thing to a lot of food plots. So if you have a quarter-acre food plot and you're hoping to hunt over it in November, and they mow it down in September, it's useless. So you may have to actually try to protect that plot with things like electric fencing in order for it to get established and be of any use to you. Some strategies, you can Google food plot strategies and everyone will kind of talk about what they got. And there's a lot out there. There's one that Missouri Extension has put out that I think is pretty nifty for general wildlife management, wildlife benefits, where you actually have a mixture of native grasses immediately adjacent to these food plots, creating shooting lanes. This is a gun plot strategy, but you're getting the benefits of the native grasses or wildlife on top of having food immediately adjacent to it. So that whole enters right outside the door mentality. But the big thing that I want to talk, why this is up here is taking the time, looking at your property, taking into account what you know about your behavior in your property, map it out, and really think about where you put that plot. It allows you to kind of visualize, how am I going to get in, where is the best place to put the plot on my property, and that's going to allow you to be more successful in the long run, outside of just planning a food plot and, well, this is the open spot, this is where I'm going to put it. So, we kind of, at the beginning I talked about knowing what's going on, or managing properties for cover, potentially managing the co-ops with the neighbors and coming up with a strategy. That's important because when you think about, you have an opportunity to put something on the landscape, right, a food source. That food source is going to be particularly important at different times of the year. You want to know potentially what your neighbor is doing, because the deer on your property have a choice in direction where they eat, right? So you kind of have to have an idea of what your neighbor may have on their property so that you either can outcompete them in some ways or offer something different so you can be able to attract deer at a different time of year. So if you are next to a corn and soybean operation and you have a 50-acre woodlot and I'll put a food plot in the middle, it's probably not a good idea to put corn and soybean in the middle of your food plot. You're not going to win. But putting a clover patch in or turnips or something, some other brassicas, is giving them an option for a different food source that is nutritionally higher quality at different time that increases the effectiveness of that food plot, at least for a short period of time, with attracting deer and competing with the 100-acre corn field. You have to be thinking, I mentioned accessibility and maintenance is a big part. If you're establishing a new food plot, you have to be thinking of, especially if it's in like a fescue field or you're transitioning an old field into a food plot, you're going to have a lot of competition the first couple of years from weeds and what's in that seed bank. So access to that and make sure you have the ability to get in there and spray is going to be vital to the success of that plot. So, the most common question that I get about food plots is, what should my mix look like? What should I plant? And that's, I always recommend trying to plant at least a mix. Give them a buffet rather than a single option feed. Something like clover, winter wheat, and turnips work really well together, and they tend to come in at different time periods and be nutritionally valuable at different time periods. It's also a great mix to try to get a clover stand established over time. But there's a lot of different mixes out there. Deer temperament and taste actually varies by individual personality. So you may plant turnips, and all your buddies are planting turnips 20, 30 miles away, and the deer are coming to them left and right, and your deer won't touch them. I've had that happen. And there's no rhyme or reason for it other than the deer in your area just don't like turnips. So this is a kind of a play around with your own operation kind of area. You have to kind of figure it out and what works for the deer in your area. You can't really, there's a lot of options, and that's the biggest problem. So as long as you're putting a bunch out there in one area, they're going to find something, and that's the advantage of the mix. You have two different kind of mixes or types of food plots. You have the cool season, right? So it's stuff that you potentially have been putting in the last month or so that is going to get established now and grow through winter. These are your winter wheat, your oats, your clover, your greens. And then if you want to go the opposite route where you're planting something in the spring that's going to provide food through the summer, are things like soybeans, cowpeas, buckwheat, sunflowers. So it's when you want to provide food. And if you have an opportunity to put multiple plots in the property, you probably want to put a little bit of everything. But most of these can all go together pretty well, where you can put 3 to 5 different types of plants in one field. And this is the other thing that we talked a little bit about native grasses and pollinator plots. And the reason, they provide almost as much forage as a deer needs to survive as a regular food plot, depending on the mix. That's why you can actually use them to graze cattle. But when you think about the mixes that are going to put a lot of forage out, they tend to be taller growing plants that are harder to see. They're providing both food and cover, so it makes hunting difficult. So that's why that whole Missouri, this is actually a food plot still, but it's a food plot with cover. And that's why it's creating these shooting lanes is overcoming that whole obscurity component for hunters. That you need to be able to shoot what you're hunting. And in order to shoot it, you need to be able to see it. So it is a nice food source, and the one part is you can talk to your farm bill biologists, because there may be funds available to put it in. It's also the bedding area. So it's not something you should overlook if you're thinking about putting some kind of food plot or wildlife management area component into your landscape. So let's talk a little bit, so you kind of hopefully made somewhat of a decision at this point of what I want to plant. Now, what are the steps of getting that into the ground? First and foremost, just like farming, you want to start with a soil test. You want to know what is the condition of that ground. Do I have to amend it? You know, if the ground is not in great condition, you're going to fail right off the bat. So you guys, are they free in your counties?
$8.
$8, $7, $7. Okay. Well worth it, especially if it's a new area that you haven't used before for a food plot or are not aware of the condition of the soil. Use the results, right? You're going to get back paper with recommendations on how to get to whatever condition you need to be in. Follow them, get them in the ground. If it's a new area, you're going to have to be thinking of, do I need to treat this area before I plant it? So, do I need to, you know, if you're going from a fescue field to a food plot, you need to go in there and kill that fescue, because that's going to be competing with whatever you put in the ground, and the fescue is going to win. So you need to make sure that you're putting the proper pre-treatment to kill potential competition. And you can talk to your agents about what that may be. And the other thing to keep in mind is that herbicide treatment becomes a lot more important if you're thinking about putting perennials in the ground, clover particularly, because you can't do as much spraying with herbicides if you put clover in to deal with any weeds that pop up, because you're going to kill the clover as well. If you're thinking about putting a perennial plot in, it's generally good to start with an annual plot for a year or two so that you can go through and kind of knock back that seed bank, whatever comes up, so that doesn't become as much of an issue later on. So, you do the soil test, you go through, you amend the soil if it's needed, you get the seed that you want to plant. Now you got to start prepping it, right? So you may have to go in, mow, right, herbicide. Generally though, you're going to want to work that soil up in some manner, shape, or form, especially the first time you're using it. You can go no-till routes late at a later point if you're already using the area. But for the first time, you want to work through that because that's going to help deal with the seed bank issues. Also, if you're amending the soil, that can help work that amendment into the ground to get that soil going in the right direction. You need to obtain your method of spreading said amendment or seed. There are multiple options out there. It's really depending on what you have access to work the ground. If you have an ATV, there's a bunch of options to put on the back of your ATV side by side. You can do it by hand. You know, you can use regular commercial equipment. They also have the portable drills. If you go to the native grass route, you can go request a drill from Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources for free. They will provide it to you. But all these are options. They make pull behind trailers that do all the above. What I generally use for demonstration purposes is I have a combination disc cultipacker, and then I'll hand spread or push spread amendments if needed. Works really well up to about an acre in size. After that, it gets a little cumbersome. When you pick your seed, name brand seed does not necessarily mean better results. Okay? Name brand seed that's tested is really important if you're commercial ag, right? You need to know you're making as much as possible. That way you generate the income you need to make money. If you are feeding wildlife, you don't necessarily need, there's not a huge difference between 2,000 pounds of forage per acre and 1,800 pounds of forage per acre to the deer that are on your property. They aren't going to care. Because it's not as big a deal to them. They're not generally going to eat themselves out of house and home. If they do, then you've got a population problem anyway. Name brand seed generally is much more expensive than going down to the local shop and paying by the pound for whatever they have for that species. You want to look at seeding rates and all those things to make sure that that actually is the case, but don't overlook just going down to the local place and grabbing what they got. Finally, we're getting in here to the component of you got everything in the ground, it's starting to grow. You need to go back in there, look for weeds, treat them. Make sure you select the correct herbicide for the type of weed you have. So you have to be able to ID it, or talk to your ag agent here about what weed it is, so they can help you ID it and suggest what you need to use to control it. There are other pests, depending on where you are planting, that you may need to be worried about. Things like groundhogs, beavers, all of those things can be a problem and work their way through a food plot quite quickly. In the case of, as long as you are the landowner, if they are destroying your food plot, you may use KRS 150.170 to protect your crop, in this case food plot, from those animals and remove them easily throughout the year, as long as it's not a federally protected species or one of the species that is reported to Fish and Wildlife, like deer, elk, turkey, and the missing one, bear, where you need a confirmation number from them to report it. So, but you don't want to do all that work and go out there and find a groundhog family that's eaten your entire food plot. That's not going to go over well, especially really not good for your hunting season plans. And finally, because usually this is not a one-year ordeal, you want to put some time in to monitor the results of your plan, and there's a couple ways you can do that, and probably a combination of methods is better. You can put out some small cages in 2 or 3 spots of your field. You don't have to, just protect enough that a deer can't put its head in there and eat all of it, right? This gives you a gauge on how successful your plot is at producing biomass. Okay, how much forage is coming out there? Because if you go out and you look across the field and say these deer weren't here, well, the plot's not growing anything. Well, in reality, it's growing a lot, but you got so many mouths eating it, it's just keeping it under the ground. And that's a sign that either you have too many deer or your food plot, you need more food on the ground. So that is the best way to look at it. And generally, you're going to have trail cameras up on your food plots for hunting purposes. So use that data in combination with the production side, and that gives you a better picture of what's going on. If it's a new plot, there are deer need to find it. Okay, so it can take 2 or 3 years before they really start keying in on it and using it and relying on it for their nutritional intake. So you may not have a whole lot of success the first year or 2 that's there. And so that's why, you may have a year where you have an excellent mass production on your property. They're not going to go to a food plot. They're going to eat all the acorns. They're going to eat them all until they're gone. Because that's how high of value they are. So if you're a good mass year and you put a food plot out, it may not get used at all, and you may think it's a total failure. I'm not going to plant this mix again. So you got to kind of think about the bigger picture, and don't jump straight to conclusions. Try to kind of understand exactly what's going on in the landscape on the property, neighbor's property, that can influence whether or not your plot is successful. Now, if you can't grow a plant, regardless of use, right? So that cage doesn't have anything in it. You got nothing going. You got bigger things going on. And that's when you call those guys. Have them come out. All right. And with that, the resource that I was talking about, and I have a copy of my backpack, I think, is Craig Harper, who is University of Tennessee's version of me. He's spent the last 20-ish years working on food plots as his program. And he's on his 2nd version of this textbook. It's an amazing resource. He breaks it down into overall strategies. He's got all kinds of information there relative to each species that you may be trying to put a food plot in for or manage for. He also gets into production level issues with each individual type of thing you can grow, the conditions that it grows best in, and production levels that you should expect, as well as having a weed key in the back, which treatment guidelines associated with each weed that you may encounter. I refer to it at least once a month. It's really good. We spend a lot of time on it. It's a great resource, and it's about 60-ish bucks, depending on which place you find it. But usually, if you just Google it, it pops right up. So, with that, I'll take any questions.
How do you feel about minerals?
So, minerals kind of, that whole component where deer are not food limited, that's where the minerals comes in. There's a lot of research with minerals in areas that deer are food limited, and they do kick in terms of helping them eat what nutritionally they're lacking. For areas in the Midwest where our soil is good, they have not been shown to impact animal health pretty much at all. Where we see that come in, and they come in really handy, is you think about it in livestock operations or in captive service facilities where those animals are limited to what they can access for food. That's where that supplement is really important, because they can't go find what they need. And that's where you see a lot of commercialization and promotion of that is for that reason, because that is filling the need, because those animals can't access it in the landscape.
There's a deer, now with chronic waste disease things here in certain counties along the line, they've stopped us from putting out in salt and everything. Deer still need salt just like people do, and I don't think they get enough fruit plants that they need. So how do they compensate for the need for salt?
So to that I would say, what did they do before we were putting salt out in the landscape 10,000 years ago? Yeah, so they were meeting their nutritional needs through the plants. They can meet the nutritional needs because our soil, they don't need as much as we think.
You think they get enough fruit plants?
Well, they do. You know, the areas they don't have access. You know, I worked up here in the middle of nowhere, Pennsylvania, that there's 90 miles in any direction. There's not a single other person really putting anything out. It's illegal to put salt out there. The deer survive. They're fine. And what salt is addicting, right? So animals will go to those salt licks and just lick. And even though they don't actually need it. So in that sense, it's a high value attractant to get animals in the area. But they're not, in areas that there's not salt licks, they're not dying. 10,000 years ago, we didn't have salt licks.
Because they only use it at certain times of the year. They don't use it in the winter. If you've got a salt lick, might be one pass through there every once in a while. But by the end of September, they hardly ever visit salt lick until the fall and spring.
Yeah, so they are in survival. So nutritionally, I didn't have this in here at the time, but nutritional needs vary throughout the year, and they're going to key in on that. And one of the big things that salt does, if you're getting excess amounts of it, is dehydrate you, right? Well, in the summer, deer are actually accessing all their water needs through eating forage. All that green stuff, they get metabolic water. So in the winter, water is actually a little more limited. They don't have access to it. So if you put a lot of salt in their system like that, they can't deal with it. It actually dehydrates them. So they're choosing not to use salt at that point because it's going to cause them nutritional problems. So, but do they need it to survive in the summer? They really don't. They get what they need elsewhere. They were fine until we created salt licks. There are natural salt licks that occur, but they're more, we'll call it like, for lack of better phrasing, I guess, a drug to them. Like, animals will go to those things. In general, all animals will go to salt licks and use them heavily. Whether or not they actually nutritionally need them is really irrelevant.
They think that they need to because they like it.
It's my grandfather put salt in everything, including his coffee. I don't know whether he didn't need it, but he liked it. And they kind of get, minerals are really good attractant in that sense, right? Providing those things, whether or not they nutritionally need it. And the concern with the CWD component is because they will come to it, every animal will come to it, you get a lot of fluid exchange and the shedding of the prion, and therefore it can be picked up. Yeah, so it's disease spread conditions.
Yeah, I mean, this is a little off the subject. I'm gonna ask before I forget it. Has chronic waste disease got Kentucky line yet?
She's gonna cover that. The answer that I know is no. So unless she's gonna drop a big heavy bomb on me here, it is no. It is very close.
I know it's
It is
close.
very close.
Close place.
And so,
Within one county.
yeah, it's within 8 miles. Yeah, so we want to keep it that way. So without jumping off her presentation here, but she's much better positioned and knowledgeable to handle those kind of questions. Anything else? I'll get that book out if anyone has any interest. You come over, take a look. Be happy to see if you have any interest in seeing it. It's over here. As long as I better make sure I have my backpack home. But thank you all. All right, let's do it. All right, let me get the notes back down here.
All right, our next speaker is Noelle Thompson, and she is the Deer and Chronic Wasting Disease Program Coordinator at the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife. And she's going to give us our chronic wasting disease update. Don't tell her. Yeah, I was wondering something.
You don't want to take a quick break or keep going? Keep going. Let's keep going.
Alright, well, you guys, this time of year and the location we're in, I think it's a good opportunity to talk about conservation anytime that we can. But I don't want this to be me talking at you. I want this to be an education opportunity more in the sense of a Q&A discussion or a myth busting session would be excellent. So we'll get into it. Just a little bit of information that I think is important to know when we talk about chronic wasting disease. This is a brain disorder disease. It's in the same family as Wilbon's encephalitis or mad cow disease. Straight in sheep, recruits spelled Yaku in humans. So these are all brain disorders. The disease agent for all of these diseases, including chronic wasting disease, is the prion. It spreads deer to deer through physical contact in the environment. So they will shed it in their saliva, their urine, their feces, their antler velvet, and it will sit in the environment for over 2.5 years, remaining infectious. It doesn't in the deer. These prions create holes in the brain, and basically they waste away. They start to act strangely. They are no longer fearing humans, other predators. They will just wander around, and then they lose functions such as eating and drinking. So they waste away. And why this is the largest threat to North American conservation wildlife? It's always fatal, there's no vaccine, and there's no treatment. And this is the main reason why we're concerned with chronic wasting disease and not EHD. We can talk about that. You can ask questions.
Can you speak a little bit louder, please?
Oh, yes. Okay, so what do I mean about wasting away? You will start to begin to see this in 5 to 10 years. And because in the Midwest we have relatively quick turnover compared to out west, you may not see deer reach these clinical stages because they're going to be harvested, predated on, roadkill, but you will always see long-term population declines in a lower age structure. Matt talked about food plots. We'll help you see 4.5-year-old bucks, 5.5-year-old bucks, no you won't. You won't see anything older than 3.5-year-old.
They don't live that long?
No. As soon as they get the disease, within 2.5 years, they die. You may not see them get to this stage because they're already starting to act strangely. They're going to get hit by a car, they're going to get killed by a coyote, or they're going to get hunted more easily. And this is why people say the disease doesn't exist, and why it's kind of a low-lying disease, because they don't reach these symptoms, whereas EHD, you see the carcasses. But it's lowering populations. So what we're doing about it within the state, we have to do a lot of surveillance. 6 out of our 7 bordering counties have the disease. We are a pocket. We do not have it yet. So that means we have to test throughout the entire state. We have a statewide surveillance system which tells us how much we have to test in each county. And it depends on how risky each county is for getting CWD. So this could be if it borders a state that has chronic wasting disease, more likely than not, bunch of factors into account when deciding how much you need to test for CWD. And then we have our high-risk 5-county CWD surveillance zone. But first, let me talk about if you want to get your deer tested for CWD. Of course, out here we have our mandatory check stations, but we also have freezer locations across the entire state to get your deer tested. Basically, you just go to any of these sites that I have mapped out. They're on our website. There's going to be a freezer there. You just drop off the HUD and give us your total check confirmation number. It's extremely easy. So we're in the area of the 5-county CWD surveillance zone, and we have this because Tennessee has detected CWD within 8 miles of our border and within 16 miles of our border during the lice hunting season. So our 5 counties are Callaway, Marshall, Graves, Hickman, and Fulton. Within these 5 counties, we have no baiting or feeding, and like Matt talked about, this congregates deer. If we know it's living in the soil for over 2.5 years, we don't want them to keep shedding prions in concentrated areas. No taking carcasses, full carcasses, or high-risk parts out of the zone. You have to debone your meat. It has to be a finished taxidermist product or a clean skull plate. Then we also have our mandatory check stations during the weekends of modern gun season this year. Last year we had them throughout early and late whistle over too. Did anyone here go to our check stations? Well, okay. We had a really good compliance rate. I think over 90% checked in the deer and went to our check stations, and a lot of people really loved it. It made them think about the good old days. We had people return even without harvested deer because they just wanted to chat some more and talk with us. We were out there on Thanksgiving and multiple people brought us food. We worked at restaurant sites and they brought us out food. The processors and taxidermists that we set up check stations at, really loved it. Brought them with us. So it was a success for us. And we got enough samples to know that we don't have chronic wasting disease in the state yet. And this is kind of unheard of. We know that deer are traveling more than 7 miles. So it's crazy to us, but we tested over 7,500 deer throughout the entire state. The dots are kind of like roadkill deer that we tested, but that just gives you an idea of how much we were testing. And then below, I know it was a worry when we asked for your location data when it came to a mandatory check station. That just helped us know, are we covering the full 5-county surveillance area by testing for CWD? Are there pockets where, we might have missed the disease, and we know that it spreads quicker within family groups. So we could have a huge pocket of chronic wasting disease and not know about it if we're only testing in this part of the county when we know the disease is here. So basically, we just use these locations to make cool maps and know where we're testing the disease.
Right now, there's one within 8 miles of the border. What are you doing to keep them from getting there? How do you manage that? I don't know way to know. That deer travel more than 8 miles, especially during the rut.
Yeah,
One deer will cross the line and bring it in.
So that's why all of our regulations
There's
are.
nothing you can do to stop that.
No, absolutely. That's, we can try to slow it by putting those regulations in place. No baiting, no feeding.
That just stops the spread, though. Now, there's nothing to do to stop it from getting there, right?
Right, but I mean, if you have some good bait and food plots right here, and deer are, there's something about the feed, deer are over here, they're more likely to move up and into the food areas. So yeah, it does help stop the slow spread, but also maybe delays the introduction of it too. Transportation of carcasses, you harvest a deer in Tennessee, you bring the carcass back with you, you lay it out in the backyard after you collect all the meat out of it. That's a ton of prions out in your backyard that the native deer are going to pick up, or the local deer are going to pick up. So right, we can't stop it, we can just monitor and know when to find captures our state. So within the 5-county surveillance area, we tested over half of the samples that came throughout the entire state, and that was over 4,300. And again, nothing detected so far. And this is pretty much unheard of. When it's at your border, you pretty much detect it nearly immediately.
And y'all start testing, when bow season comes in, is that when the testing will start?
So if there's any suspect deer that are acting strangely, showing signs of it, we will, test those immediately, get those samples shipped off, so that's throughout the entire year. We're collecting roadkill throughout the entire year, especially in this area, but yes, as soon as the hunting season starts, we're getting as many samples as we can, which is why that freezer program is so important, trying to collect all these samples voluntarily.
We're way over around the little circle over there.
Yeah.
That's us. We couldn't get to y'all without crossing into Tennessee, so they couldn't let us.
You
do
just have
that.
to call law enforcement.
So, well, what they did, they didn't have a freezer, apparently they brought a big blue barrel.
Oh, I think it's that like muzzle loader.
A couple of days, they were late, they got to smell
So we tried to do truck stations during late muzzle loader tornadoes, did some things. So we had to put some barrels out and we got a few heads, but wasn't as successful. But really that's all I have for you guys. I just want to take this opportunity to answer questions. It's coming and you guys are gonna have to deal with it.
When it comes to the detail of the actual disease itself, like, I think you were saying that a deer usually doesn't get to its full potential. Does it attack certain organs? Can it attack certain organs? And then kill the deer within a half a year, you know?
No, it spreads pretty consistently in each deer. So, it starts in the lymph nodes, which is what we test, and which is how we can detect the sickness within a deer. But then, your spinal column, your brain, it just kind of wastes away. Eventually you find it in meat, and in blood.
When you talk about the age structure, you're saying by the time you get 2.5, it's gonna die, so we won't see any more, unless over 3.5. What if you don't get to those 2.5? How fast is it progress from disease? Is it different rates?
Yeah, so it can vary. But if it's in an area where the disease has been, it's going to get it within their first year of life.
First year.
And then it's usually about 2.5 years that they die since being infected. So if they get it within a year, they're going to die in 2.5 years.
So it's less likely with a more mature deer.
Right. I mean, it's possible, but if the soil has it, all the surrounding deer have it, they're going to pick it up.
So in other words, every deer in the whole herd is gonna eventually have it. Why don't, they're not gonna all die at the same time, that will keep the herd going?
Right, yeah, and just because, they breed so early on and they breed so quickly that the population is gonna keep going and turning over. They're just not gonna reach that older age class.
Usually, the turnover is usually better than the kill rate.
Right, especially in the Midwest. So out in the West, Colorado, Wyoming, we're seeing all these sick deer and we're seeing really low population sizes because the disease has been out there for over 30 years.
Yeah. Well, do you think, or the biologists think, in the future, maybe the deer will develop a new or good, or some kind of system to fight it on?